I was just a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, though back then, no one cared much to count age the way people do today. I would simply say I was small, and that was that. I grew up in a wooden house that creaked whenever the wind slipped through the cracks, as if time itself was whispering secrets I could not yet understand. In those days, families did not have much to share beyond hope. My father was a man of few words and eyes so tired it seemed the world rested on his shoulders. He worked in the fields before the sun even stirred and only came home when the sky turned red, ready to fade again. My mother never had much time to spare either, yet she still found a way to keep the house in order, the fire burning, and the smell of fresh bread drifting through the kitchen. I liked to sit in a corner by the wood stove, where there was a low little stool. That was my favorite hiding place. I pretended I was caring for dolls made of corn cobs, but in truth, I just wanted to stay near her, feeling her warmth and listening to her voice. Are you curious to find out how it all happened? Then subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. I love to know where you're following me from. And look, if I were you, I wouldn't miss what's coming up. The truth I'm about to reveal will move you in ways you can't even imagine. Are you ready? But that night, her voice never came. I remember it as if it were now. The silence in the kitchen was so heavy it felt like a thick blanket covering everything. I didn't know what had happened. I only noticed she was crying slowly, as if she were afraid of making a sound. Tears slid unhurried down her weary face. It was the first time I saw my mother cry, and I had no idea what to do. I just sat there, very still, wishing I could disappear so I wouldn't get in the way. It was in that moment that I learned there are pains that do not need witnesses, that there are times when we keep quiet, because words would be like twigs tossed into a fire. They would only feed the flames. I didn't ask anything, not when she wiped her face with the edge of her apron and gave me a half smile that never reached her eyes, not when she went over to the stove and stirred the embers as if doing so could bring order back to the world. I simply watched, and inside me, a strange little flame lit up. It was a mixture of fear and respect, the feeling that in that silence there was a force bigger than any shout. After that night, I began to pay attention to silences. I started to notice that each person had their own way of being quiet. My father, for example, would silence himself with his arms. When he was angry, he would leave everything and go out into the yard, pacing in circles, clenching his teeth, staring at the ground. My mother would silence herself with her eyes. When something hurt her, she would lower her head and pretend to be busy. My brother, who was older than I was, would silence himself with tight lips, holding back tears as if crying was a shame. And I silenced myself in a way no one noticed. I would hide in my little corner and think. It was as if I kept inside my chest all the questions I was too scared to ask. In those years, silence became my companion. The house was always full of voices when the rest of the family came to visit. My aunts spoke loudly, my cousins ran from room to room, and the smell of coffee mixed with tobacco and burnt wood. But the moment a problem arose, a bill that couldn't be paid or bad news arriving, everything fell quiet at once. It was as if the whole world held its breath, and I learned to sense when that silence was coming. It was almost an unwelcome guest, but an inevitable one. The other children in the neighborhood did not understand. They thought I was strange for being so quiet, but I knew there was power in saying nothing. While they talked endlessly, I listened. I kept in my heart everything the grown-ups let slip without realizing. A sigh, a hard look, a gesture of impatience. That was how I began to understand that what hurts the most is often not what is said, but what stays buried deep inside the soul, hidden behind silence. I remember an afternoon when my mother asked me to go to the store to fetch flour. The sky was heavy with clouds, about to spill a storm. I ran down the dirt road, clutching the sack to my chest, afraid the rain would catch me before I could get home. When I walked into the store, I found Mr. Antero, the owner, sitting behind the counter reading an old newspaper. He looked up and asked if everything was all right at home. I didn't know how to answer. I just shrugged. It was the first time I realized that outside the walls of our house, people also noticed the weight of our silence. When I got back, my mother was standing in the doorway, looking at the horizon as if she hoped something would get better by itself. I handed her the flour, and she thanked me in a whisper. In that moment, I understood my mother carried more than the day's chores. She carried an entire world inside her chest, a world of sorrows she never shared with anyone. And I began to want to learn how to be strong like her. That night, while the rain drummed on the roof, I made a promise to myself. I would also learn how to keep silent when needed. I would be able to protect what had to be protected, even if it cost me my words, because I understood there are things that only survive if we keep them quiet. That is how my story began. Not with great events or fiery speeches, but with the sound of a woman crying softly, thinking no one heard her, and with a little girl sitting by the stove, learning that sometimes silence is the greatest weapon we can have. I had already passed the first years of my innocence when I began to feel that urge to answer back. It was like an itch on my tongue, a tightness in my chest telling me I needed to speak. But I always remembered that night when my mother cried so softly, and the silence felt like a heavy blanket over everything. And no matter how the words bubbled inside me, almost escaping through my lips, I held them back. I learned early that speaking at the wrong time could be like tossing a spark into dry grass. It was on a Sunday morning that this lesson became clearer than ever. I must have been about 10 years old, but it felt as if I already carried the age of an old woman on my shoulders. The day had started beautifully, the sky so blue it almost hurt my eyes. My mother got up early to light the fire and make strong black coffee, the kind she said put courage in a person's body. My father went out to see if the hens had laid any eggs, and my brother was outside sharpening a knife on the stone, with that focused look he had when he did not want to talk to anyone. I stayed in the kitchen helping peel cassava. The silence between us was not heavy, but it was not light either. It was just that habit of people who already understood each other without needing many words. I was there, quiet, when I heard the sound of a horse approaching the yard. It was Uncle Romeo, my father's brother. He did not come often, but whenever he did, the whole house seemed to brace for bad news or some argument he brought hidden under his hat. He walked in without knocking, as if he owned everything. His face was burned by the sun, and his small eyes scanned the kitchen, looking for something to criticize. He greeted my mother with a dry nod and immediately asked for my father. I could tell right away there would be trouble. My heart started to beat differently, warning me I would have to hold my tongue not to speak out. My father appeared in the doorway, still holding his straw hat, and the two of them stared at each other for a moment that lasted too long. No one said anything. Then Uncle Romeo began to speak loudly, complaining about a stretch of fence that, according to him, my father had moved. I did not really understand what it was about, but I knew it was serious. His voice kept rising like a river after the rain. I looked over at my mother, waiting for her to do something, but she simply lowered her eyes and kept working the cassava. That was when I felt the itch on my tongue. I wanted to defend my father. I wanted to say he was no thief of land, that he always worked hard, that he never needed to take anything from anyone. I wanted to shout at that man to leave and let our family be. The words fluttered inside me like birds trapped in a cage. My chest hurt from the effort of holding them in. But then I looked at my father. He stood with his head high, his face locked shut like a door. He did not explain himself. He did not beg. He just kept his silence. I realized that for him, to answer would be to lower himself, to give more strength to a brother who had come looking for a fight. My father would rather stay quiet and let silence speak for his dignity. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes not answering is the only way not to lose what little respect you still have left. Uncle Romeo talked until he wore himself out. He repeated the same accusations, circling the kitchen like a rooster fighting his own shadow. When he saw he would get no reply, he spat on the floor and left, the spurs clanging on the doorframe. The sound of the hooves fading down the road was a relief. Only then did my father take a deep breath, hang his hat, and walk out without saying a word. I stood there, cassava in hand, feeling I had learned something important, even if I did not understand everything. Later, my mother called me to help sweep the yard. I still had that tightness in my chest. At last, unable to hold it any longer, I asked why my father had not said anything. She leaned the broom against the wall and looked straight into my eyes. It was one of the few times she spoke to me as if I were already grown. "Because, my daughter, there are fights you only win by not joining them," she said. "When your tongue itches, your heart tightens, and anger wants to pour out, that is when you must keep quiet. Because whoever shouts too much ends up losing their reason." I never forgot those words, and that night, lying on my narrow bed, I kept thinking about how hard it is to hold back words when they feel ready to burst. I wondered if that was cowardice or courage, but the more I thought about it, the more I understood that silence can be a far harder choice than speaking. The years passed and other moments came. Many times I saw my father suffer injustices. I saw my mother judged by people who did not know even half our story. I saw my brother bite his lips to keep from answering an insult, and each time, that itch on my tongue returned. The urge to speak was like a fever, but almost always I chose to stay silent, not because I lacked words, but because I knew that sometimes words could wound worse than they could heal. There was an afternoon when a neighbor came to say I was too full of myself, that I never talked to anyone because I thought I was better. I could have explained it was simply my way, that I preferred to listen, but I kept quiet. And deep down, I realized my silence troubled her more than anything I might have said. Sometimes, when you do not answer, the other person is left to hear their own voice, and that can hurt more than an argument. With time, I came to understand that this silence living inside us is not empty. It is filled with everything we do not say, the truths that do not need to be shouted, the hurts we choose not to spread, the pride that, if left loose, turns to poison. Each time I stayed quiet, I felt I was storing something in my chest that made me stronger, even if no one could see it. That is how I learned that the tongue itches and the heart tightens, but silence can be the only way to keep the fire from spreading. And through the years, that lesson became part of who I am. In life, there are moments that seem to come only to test us. I thought I had already learned almost everything about silence, about the strength it holds, about how it can be both shield and prison. But it was on that day I discovered that silence could also be an act of love, so big it hurt. It was a late summer afternoon, one of those days when the heat makes the earth rise in red dust and the horizon shimmers like a mirage. I was helping my mother fold the clothes that had dried on the line. I remember the smell of ash soap, the rough fabric against my palms, and her voice telling me to be careful with the good pieces, the ones we saved for Sunday Mass. Everything felt ordinary until I heard hurried hoofbeats coming down the road. It was a different sound, a gallop that was not a visit. My mother lifted her head and looked at me with those eyes that already knew when something bad was about to happen. Soon after, the gate creaked open and Tonico appeared, the son of Comadre Clorinda. His face was white with fear and his mouth dry from running. I had never seen a boy so shaken. Before he could say anything, my mother dropped the clothes and went to him. I followed, my heart racing. "Donna Rosalia, I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's something I have to tell you," he said, voice trembling. "It's about Mr. Antonio. He's at Zé Fagundes' tavern. There was a terrible fight. They're saying he killed a man." I felt my legs go weak. My father, accused of killing someone? I could not believe it. My mother pressed her hand to her chest, but she did not cry. She did not scream. She just breathed slowly, as if she knew that if she let the pain spill out all at once, nothing would be left to hold her up. Tonico said a few more things, but I did not hear them. The sound of my own heart was louder than any word. My mother thanked him for the message and went back inside, her steps heavier than her whole body. I stood on the porch, staring at the path where Tonico had disappeared, thinking how life could turn upside down in the blink of an eye. After a while, my mother returned and told me I needed to stay home, to look after my little brother while she went to the tavern to see what had happened. I wanted to go with her, but I obeyed. I sat in the wicker chair, watching the evening fall, trying to understand if any of it was real. The hours passed slowly, as if time itself were lazy. The sky grew dark, and I lit the oil lamp, but its light flickered and barely lit anything. When my mother came back, her face was grave. She only said my father was hiding in the barn behind Zé Fagundes' place and that it was not true he had killed the man. There had been a fight, but the other fellow had staggered away alive. In our parts, though, all it took was someone to yell, "Murder," for it to become the truth. My father could not return home until the story was cleared up. I remember how my chest ached from fear. Fear of losing my father, fear of seeing my mother helpless, fear that shame would stick to our family like a stain no soap could wash. Then she looked at me and spoke in that calm voice she saved for the worst moments. "Daughter, tomorrow, When they come to ask, you don't say anything. Don't tell where he is. Don't explain. Whoever needs to know already knows, and the ones who just want to stir our troubles don't deserve an answer. That night, I hardly slept. I kept thinking of every neighbor's face, all of them who would come the next day pretending to be concerned, asking just for decency's sake, and I knew my silence would be taken as guilt. But even so, I promised myself I would not speak. The next morning, the yard looked busier than on feast days. First came the women from the village, then the men who worked with my father, then strangers I had never seen before. All of them wanted to know where he was, if the rumors were true. And I, with my heart clenched tight, only lowered my gaze. One woman even grabbed my arm and said it would be better for me to tell, so my father could defend himself. But I knew that was not what she wanted. She wanted the story, the gossip, the pleasure of witnessing our downfall. The sun was high in the sky when a man on a black horse appeared. He was the sheriff, a man who could scare you with just a glance. He did not speak to me, he spoke to my mother. He asked if she had any news. My mother replied that she had nothing to say. I felt my tongue itch, the urge to explain, to declare that my father was innocent, that it was all a lie. But I stayed silent, because I understood that if I spoke, I might put him in danger. That was the day I realized silence is not only about enduring pain, it is also about protecting the ones you love. I was so afraid it felt like my soul might leave my body, but I kept quiet, and every unspoken word was like a brick in the wall we were building around my father. When night came, I was so tired I could not feel my legs. My mother called me inside and held me tight. Only then did I cry. I cried out everything I had held back, everything I had not said. And in the middle of my sobbing, I felt that this silence, which had seemed so heavy, was in truth a relief, because I knew I had done the only thing that could be done. After a few days, the truth came to light. The man my father had fought returned to the village alive and well. Those who had spoken ill of us vanished slowly, as if they had never been there. My father came home in a silent dawn. When I saw him step through the doorway, I understood that my silence had saved his life. And that certainty stayed with me, like a medal no one could see but that I carried in my heart. I grew up hearing that marriage was a serious thing, that a man and a woman had to learn to endure each other as if carrying a burden, but also as if guarding a treasure. In those days, no one spoke of separation. When two people decided to join their lives, it was until the end, whether that end was good or bad. And that was how I married your grandfather, without grand parties, without lace dresses, but with a heart full of hope and fear. I was very young. I had just left my parents' house, my hands still rough from helping in the fields and working in the kitchen. Your grandfather was older than I was, a man whose body carried the fatigue of someone who had worked since he was a boy. He did not have many words, but he had a strength that seemed to me like a promise that nothing essential would ever be missing. And in truth, he never let us go without the basics. But you learn that life does not stand only on food on the table and a roof over your head. There are other hungers that grow in the heart. In the first months, I grew used to waking up to the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor, well before sunrise. He would leave quietly, pulling on his boots by the door so as not to wake the children, and he only returned when the day was already weary. When he came home, he hung his hat on a peg in the wall, washed his face, and sat at the table, always with the same serious expression. Sometimes I would look at him and wonder if he was happy or simply resigned, but I never had the courage to ask. Our conversations were short, almost always about the bills, the weather, the harvest. I had so much to say, but never said it. I wanted to tell him that I missed a kind word, that my heart felt tight when he went days without looking me in the eye. But every time I thought about speaking, I remembered my mother saying that a woman must learn to keep quiet, to keep the house standing. And so, my silence became a wall between us. There was one day I have never forgotten. It was winter, the wind slipping through the cracks in the door, and I was sitting there sewing a patch onto his shirt. He came in, took off his hat, and sat on the bench near the stove. I felt like asking why he never told me he loved me. The question rose in my throat like a sob, but then he looked at me and only said that the cold would worsen that night and that it was best I put more wood on the fire. In that moment, I swallowed the question along with all the others I had been keeping. If I had spoken, perhaps he would have understood how much I missed him even when he was close. But the fear of seeming ungrateful, the fear of opening a wound I would not know how to close, was stronger. And so, year after year, we lived among words we never said. Sometimes, when he was asleep, I would run my hand over his face and wonder how it might have been if we had had the courage to truly talk. I know he loved me in his own way. His love was not made of declarations, but of small sacrifices I only came to see later. He carried sacks of corn on his back when we could not afford transport. He repaired the roof by himself, even when his back ached. He always left the last piece of meat for me, even if I pretended not to notice. But at the time, my young heart did not understand that some loves do not know how to become words. I had my own faults too. Sometimes the loneliness turned to resentment. I would spend days saying only what was necessary, hoping he would miss my voice. But he was not one to notice silences. Or perhaps he did, and only pretended not to. There was a night when we lay down with our backs turned to each other. I stayed awake for hours, wanting to turn over and say I was tired of keeping quiet. But I remained silent, because in that moment, silence felt safer than any truth. The years went by, and life grew harder. Illness came, debts came, losses we did not choose came. And in the middle of it all, I came to understand that love is a way of insisting, even when tenderness goes into hiding. When he fell ill, I was the one who cared for him. I fed him medicine, wiped the fever sweat from his forehead, whispered prayers that God would not take him away too soon. And in every night I kept watch, I thought about the words we had never spoken. That was when I realized that even without talking, we had built something that belonged to us alone. On his last night, I sat beside the bed, holding the hand already growing cold. I wanted to say that despite everything, I had been happy, that he had truly been my companion, even if he never knew how to show it. But my voice would not come. It stayed trapped, as always. And in silence, he left. A silence that this time was not empty, but full of everything we had lived. If I could go back in time, I would have spoken. I would have said my heart had learned to beat next to his. I would have thanked him for every small gesture. But back then, we did not know that words could be medicine. We thought silence was respect, and in a way it was. But sometimes I think an "I love you" might have made all the difference. Today, when people ask me about your grandfather, I smile and say he was a good man. And he was. He was a man who taught me that love can live in silence. But he also taught me that silence has a price. And if we are not careful, it will collect little by little everything that could have been said. Life has a curious way of teaching us that what looks like weakness may, deep down, be the greatest strength we carry. It took me many years to understand that my silence was not only fear, nor just the habit of a woman raised to obey. There was a time when I myself believed that keeping quiet was shrinking myself, letting others trample my heart without defense. But as the days, the losses, the quarrels, and the reconciliations passed, I discovered there was great power in what I did not say. It was after your uncles grew up that I began to see that strength. When they were little, I thought I had to show everything, teach everything with words. I spent the whole day giving instructions. Don't run, don't shout, don't touch the fire. And the more I spoke, the more it seemed no one listened. I would go to bed with my throat tired from scolding. Then one afternoon, after too much crying and noise, I simply fell silent. I sat on the bench by the porch and stayed there, looking at the yard, not saying a single word. And in the quiet that settled, the children, who were still running and shouting, began to grow still. At first, they were puzzled by my calm. Then they came closer, wanting to know why I wasn't speaking. I didn't answer. I just looked into their eyes. It was the first time I saw that silence could teach more than 1,000 sermons. From that day on, I began to use silence like someone who discovers a secret weapon. When visitors came and someone made an unkind remark about my house, I smiled and said nothing. While the other person hurried to justify their rudeness, I stayed steady. And often, my silence made it clear I had nothing to prove. It forced them to hear their own words, to feel ashamed. I could see when that discomfort arrived. It was like a wave that came slowly and washed away the courage of whoever had tried to wound me. There was one occasion that marked me deeply. It was when your grandfather was still alive, but already tired, already sick, A neighbor came by to demand an old debt. He spoke loudly, roughly, right there in front of the children. He said that if my husband didn't pay soon, he would take our little flock as payment. I could have shouted back. I could have answered that he knew nothing of our struggles. But I stayed silent. I simply held the door of the chicken coop he threatened to seize. I didn't say a word. The man grew uneasy. He began repeating the same threats, but without conviction. Finally, he turned around and left, muttering, and I stood there, feeling that my quiet had more weight than any argument. I won't say it was easy to learn this. Many times my silence was heavy with pain and hurt. I would go back inside and cry softly, hidden in the bedroom, because I needed to ease my chest. But I never regretted staying quiet, because every time I chose silence, I was choosing not to give others the power to bring me down. The curious thing is that, in time, people began to respect me, not out of fear, but because they understood my calm was not passivity. It was a choice. When someone asked why I didn't respond to provocations, I said it was because those who talk too much end up betraying themselves. And those who learn to listen carry inside themselves the truths no one else dares to say. That was how I became the confidant of so many. Neighbor women came to tell me their secrets, their sins, their sorrows, because they knew I wouldn't open my mouth to spread anything. My silence became a refuge for other women who needed to unburden and could not find, anywhere else, an ear without judgment. I never thought myself better than anyone. I only came to understand, little by little, that words have their worth, but silence has its moment. When we speak in haste, we often say what we shouldn't. When we keep quiet out of fear, we let others dominate us. But when we choose silence on purpose, that silence becomes a fortress. It turns into a shield against malice and a balm for our heart. There was a year when the harvest failed, and poverty walked through the front door. Your grandfather spent whole days sitting on the threshold, looking at the horizon, trying to figure out how to feed the family. I knew he blamed himself for not being able to give us more comfort. I had my own worries, my own frustrations, but instead of demanding words from him that he couldn't give, I kept quiet. Sometimes I sat beside him and simply held his hand. We said nothing, but that silence was our way of saying we were together. And in those dark days, that quiet is what kept us standing. That was how I understood, once and for all, that my silence was not weakness. It was strength. It was the certainty that no one could take away what I carried inside, that I could lose everything, what little money we had, my health, even the company of those I loved, but my dignity would not be sold for words thrown into the wind. Today, when I look back, I see that it was this silence that shaped my destiny. It taught me to listen without judging, to wait without despair, to love without demanding a return. It gave me the strength not to repay injustice with more injustice. And most of all, it taught me that the greatest power we have is deciding how we respond to what life does to us. When your uncles grew up, they began to see this too. One of them told me, as an adult, that he thought I was the strongest woman he had ever known. I smiled and didn't correct him, because he was right. My silence was, and still is, my greatest strength. And it was what taught me that sometimes the most powerful answer is the one you do not give. I always knew that my quiet way was not easy for others to understand. Since I was a girl, I heard sideways comments. People said that those who kept silent were hiding something, that those who did not share their thoughts must have guilt in their hearts. And no matter how hard I tried to show that my silence was not contempt, many preferred to imagine it was pride. I learned early that the world has trouble accepting someone who does not hurry to explain everything. When I was young, this already caused me sorrow. While the other women gathered to chat by the wash basin or around the sewing, I preferred to stay a little apart, just listening. It was not that I disliked company. I even longed for friendship, but there was something in me that needed silence to think. It was in quiet that I put my feelings in order, but no one saw it that way. More than once, I overheard whispers that I thought myself better than the others. One neighbor once asked me, with irony in her eyes, if I was afraid of wasting words. I only smiled and did not answer, because if I had answered, it would have been worse. With time, I realized that my silence also became a mirror. Those who came near me, used to talking too much, would start hearing themselves. Sometimes a person would say something and the next moment grow embarrassed, as if only then realizing the weight of their own words. That was how I came to see that silence can be uncomfortable for those whose conscience is uneasy. And this, strangely enough, attracted confession. People told me secrets I had never asked about, simply because my silence felt like a safe space. Your grandfather was one of the ones who took longest to understand my way. In the early years of our marriage, he was annoyed by my quiet. He said he would rather have a woman who fought, who threw everything in his face at once, because then he knew where he stood. I listened to that without answering back, and inside, I wondered if he could not see that my silence was also a form of respect. I did not want to hurt. I did not want to add to discord. I only needed time. But in those first years, he did not see it that way. He thought my silence was distance, that I did not trust him. Only after much life together did he start to see that my silence had many meanings. Sometimes it was weariness. Other times it was caution not to say something that would wound. And sometimes it was simply my way of processing the pains of the day. When the children came, he noticed that I was the same with them. I did not shout without measure. I did not make a scene. I preferred to sit nearby, waiting for them to calm, and then, only then, I would say what was needed. He began to accept that this was part of who I was. Even so, there were always those who did not understand. There was a time when one of my sisters-in-law started spreading that I was cold. She said I did not love anyone, that I only thought of myself. I found out by chance when one of the neighbors, perhaps wanting to provoke, came to tell me. Inside, that hurt me like a knife. I wondered whether my lack of words had really given that impression. I spent nights without sleep, thinking whether I should change, whether I should learn to speak more, to open up more. But every time I tried, I felt I was betraying myself, because my silence was not emptiness. It was full of everything I felt and did not know how to put into sentences. One day, after much brooding, I decided I would no longer worry about what people thought. I was sure my way was honest. I did not pretend affection, but I did not pretend indifference either. Whoever wanted to know what I felt only had to look at my gestures, my care, my presence. I was always there. Even silent, I was whole. There was an episode that showed me this clearly. It was when your youngest uncle fell ill with a high fever. I spent 3 nights without sleeping, sitting by his bed, wetting a cloth to cool his forehead. When he got better, one of the neighbors came in and said, I must be relieved because, after all, I did not look so worried. I looked at her without saying a word, and in that moment, I felt my silence was my defense. I knew how much fear I had felt. I knew how many prayers I had whispered in secret. I did not need to prove my love to anyone. With the years, I became known as a woman of few words. Some respected it, others found it strange. But I learned not to expect understanding. We do not live to please other people's comprehension. We live to keep peace with our own conscience. And I only had peace when I kept to my quiet way, when I did not force myself to speak, just to fill the emptiness of others. Even today, when someone asks why I was always so silent, I smile and say, it is because silence teaches me. It is in silence I understand what I feel. It is in silence I hear what God wants to tell me. And most of all, it is in silence I find strength to go on, because those who do not speak are not the ones who feel nothing. Often, they are the ones who feel the deepest, but they choose to keep in their hearts what would be wasted if turned into noise. There are things we keep in our hearts because we don't know how to say them. Others we keep quiet about because we know that, if spoken, they could hurt more than help. I was never one to gossip, never liked to spread other people's stories. But there was a secret that did not belong to others. It was mine. A secret that stayed with me for so many years that after a while, it felt like part of who I was. I don't know exactly when it began. Perhaps it was during the time when your grandfather was very ill, when life felt like a floor breaking apart beneath our feet. The days were long, full of worry, and the nights were even longer. It was then that a man appeared in my life. Don't think it was romance, because it wasn't. But it was a friendship different from anything I had known. He was a widower who lived on a small farm over by the stream. He had been an old friend of your grandfather and sometimes came by to offer help. Sometimes he brought firewood. Other times, some food left over from his harvest. I always thanked him with respect, but we didn't talk much. It was only when your grandfather took to his bed for good that he started coming more often. Sometimes he would sit on the porch bench, keeping quiet with me. The two of us hardly spoke, but that silence did me good. It was like a rest. I didn't have to be strong all the time. I didn't have to smile, didn't have to pretend courage. I just needed to be there. As the months passed, I grew used to his presence. When I knew he was coming, I felt a strange peace. I grew nervous, not out of shame, but because I feared people would notice. We never did anything sinful, but in those days, just an exchanged glance could turn into gossip. There was an afternoon I never forgot. I was in the yard, taking clothes off the line, when he appeared without my seeing him. He stood there by the fence, waiting for me to notice. When I lifted my eyes, I saw he was holding a small bundle. It was a piece of fresh cheese. He held it out and said it was a gift because I looked tired. I thanked him, but couldn't look into his eyes. It was the first time I realized that this friendship was different. It wasn't desire. It wasn't betrayal. It was just an encounter of two lonely souls, but I knew no one would understand. When your grandfather died, I thought that story would die too, and for a while, it did. He stopped coming by, maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear. I busied myself with the children, the chores, the mourning. Years went by without my seeing his face, but sometimes I remembered that afternoon with the cheese, and I felt a quiet longing I kept only for myself. Years later, he started coming again. By then, I was an older woman, hardened by everything. There was nothing left between us that could be called sin. We would sit under the fig tree and talk about a life that had passed too quickly. He would tell me about his sorrows, the absences he had carried. I would tell him mine. And in the silence between one sentence and another, I understood that God had given us that companionship as comfort. But no one ever knew. Not your uncles, not the neighbors, not his family. I never told because I felt that this secret was a place where I could rest, a place that was mine alone. I knew that if I opened my mouth, if I said that for so many years my heart had held that quiet affection, they would say it was a sin, that it was disrespectful to your grandfather's memory. I didn't have the courage to explain that love has many shapes, and that this was not the love that destroys homes. It was just a caring that had stretched across a lifetime. For decades, I carried this secret as if it were a thread of gold hidden in the fold of my apron. I never felt it as guilt. It was a light weight, because I knew there was nothing dirty in it, but it was still a weight, because everything unsaid grows roots in our souls. It was only many years later, when he was too old to walk to my house, that I realized I might never see him again. One day, I gathered my courage and went to his farm. He was sitting in a wicker chair, his face full of wrinkles and peace. When he saw me, he smiled in that way that needed no explanations. I sat beside him, and we sat there together, remembering what had never been spoken. When it was time to leave, he held my hand. He said he was afraid of dying, without me knowing how much my friendship had meant to him. I answered in a low voice that I had always known, and that, even without words, we had done each other good. It was the only time I spoke about our secret aloud, and it was the last time I saw him. He died not long after. When I heard, I cried as if losing a brother. In those tears, I felt that the silence which had united us was also proof that life is made of things no one else needs to understand. Some stories belong only to those who lived them, and that is all right. Today, when I think about that secret, I feel no shame. I feel gratitude, because it was in it that I realized silence can be the house where we keep what is most precious. Not all silence is loneliness. Sometimes it is simply the purest way to love someone. Not every silence is a virtue. It took me a long time to understand that. I had to lose some things. I had to watch people I loved get hurt, to realize that my quiet way also had its cost. There are moments when keeping silent is wisdom, but there are others when keeping silent is cowardice. And those who have spent a lifetime swallowing words know the difference when the heart tightens. I remember well the first time I realized my silence could hurt more than any shout. It was with your oldest uncle. He was always a quiet boy, much like me. He was the sort who suffered in silence, who swallowed his tears so no one would worry. When he became a young man, he carried a sadness on his shoulders I did not know the origin of. I could see the way he would come home from the fields, drop the hoe in the corner, and sit on the doorstep, his eyes lost. I felt inside me that something was wrong, but, as I always did, I kept quiet. I thought that if he wanted to tell me, he would, that my silence was respect, that giving space was a way to show love. But deep down, I was also afraid afraid to hear a truth I would not be able to mend. And so, time passed, each of us keeping silent on our side. I occupied myself with the house, he occupied himself with the fields, and between us remained an empty space full of questions nobody asked. There was a day he came home earlier than usual. I was making bread, my hands full of flour, when I saw him come in without looking at me. My heart beat differently, as if God were telling me it was time to speak. But I did not speak. I waited. I waited for him to say what he needed. He went upstairs to his room and stayed there until the next day. When he came down, he seemed like another man. His eyes were red, but his face was hard. I tried to ask if he was all right. He only shook his head, and once more, I kept quiet. Years later, he gathered courage and told me that, back then, he had thought about leaving and never coming back. He said he felt alone, that he thought nobody noticed his pain. When I heard that, I felt my heart break in a place that never completely healed. I wished I could go back in time, go up those stairs, enter the room, and say I cared, that he was loved, but I did not. And nothing I say now erases the emptiness my silence left in his heart. I also remember a friend from my youth who fell sick with sorrow after losing her little son. She would come to my house and sit in the porch chair without saying anything. I kept her company, made coffee, offered her a sweet, but almost never did I speak words of comfort. I thought silence was the best medicine, that she only needed presence. One day, after a long time, she told me she missed hearing that everything would be all right, that she needed someone to say the pain would pass. I had never thought of that. For me, silence was care, but for her, it was abandonment. It was after those stories that I understood silence can also hurt, that there are pains that only heal when they find a soft word to rest on. I started paying attention. When the children came to talk, I no longer just listened. I learned to say that I understood, that I cared. I learned to apologize if my quiet ways had caused hurt. It was hard. The words felt heavy in my mouth, but I discovered that sometimes love needs to be spoken, not only shown. There was a day when one of my granddaughters asked me if I had ever told your grandfather, "I love you." I had no answer, because thinking back, I don't think I ever said it outright. It wasn't the custom in our family, but it was also fear. Fear of seeming weak, fear of opening my heart too wide. And in that moment, I realized that my voice had been missed, that it would have been beautiful for him to hear that from me, even just once. As we grow old, we begin to measure life not only by what we did, but also by what we did not do. I am proud of my silence because it was my defense, but I also carry regret for the times it was a wall, for the times when one word of mine could have saved someone from the abyss of loneliness. Today, if I could teach one thing, it would be this. Don't be afraid to speak when your heart asks you to, because there are silences that protect, but there are others that become chains. And those who stay quiet too long end up trapped in their own fear. I learned late that the voice is also a bridge. And that saying, "I love you, I care, I am here," may be what holds someone up on their darkest day. If I had known that before, I would have said much more. I would have hugged more, asked more, cried along more often. I would have used less silence to hide my frailty. But this is a lesson life only teaches after time has passed. And today, when I close my eyes to remember, I see that my silence was strength, but sometimes it was absence. And that is something I carry with me, without shame, but with humility. Because no one is born knowing the right time to be silent and the right time to speak. We learn by making mistakes. We learn by losing. We learn by loving the only way we know how. And I loved deeply, even without saying it. I always believed that we don't only inherit the land or the objects left behind when someone goes. We also inherit the examples, the habits, the fears. And in my case, silence was an inheritance I received, and without realizing it, passed on. I remember my mother sitting on the wooden bench by the stove, stirring the pot without hurry. She almost never raised her voice. When she had something important to say, she would call us aside, look us firmly in the eyes, and speak slowly. But most of the time, she said nothing. She preferred silence. Sometimes I thought she carried inside her a whole world that no word could ever hold. I grew up watching that restrained way and thinking that this was how a strong woman acted, by keeping everything to herself. When I became a young woman and later a mother, I realized that I carried that same quietness. At first, I thought it was just shyness. Later, I understood it was something deeper. It was as if my heart had learned still in childhood that silence is protection, that it is better to keep quiet than to hand ammunition to those who don't understand us. And that was how I raised my children. I wasn't one to share everything I felt. When I was worried, I would mend clothes, sweep the yard, boil the milk. When I was sad, I would sit at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, waiting for the hurt to settle. When someone asked what was wrong, I only said, "Nothing, it will pass." And so, without meaning to, I was teaching that problems are to be kept inside. That pain is faced alone. For a long time, I thought this was a virtue. I was proud not to be a woman of fuss, not to go around crying in corners. I told myself that my children would respect my example, and in part, they did. But they were also marked by that silence. There was a night when your youngest uncle, already a grown man, sat on the porch with me. He stayed quiet for a long time, just like I did. Then, after a deep sigh, he told me that he felt he didn't know how to talk, that when life became hard, he couldn't ask for help, and that sometimes he was afraid of seeming cold to the people he loved. When I heard that, I felt a tightness in my chest. It was as if I were looking at myself only in a man's body. In that moment, I understood that my silence had not been only strength. It had been a mirror. That was when I realized that what we keep inside doesn't die with us. It passes from one heart to another like an invisible inheritance. If we are not careful, we give our children not only the good parts, but also the hard ones. I started thinking that perhaps I should have said more, explained more, hugged more. But life has no rewind button. What we do is done. Even so, I wanted to change something. Even in old age, I decided I could show another way to be. I began trying to speak more to your uncles and aunts. I would ask about their troubles, tell a little about my own. In the beginning, no one quite knew how to react. The conversations came stumbling, like children learning to walk. But after a while, it became more natural. I understood it's never too late to teach another path. I also watched my grandchildren growing up. So many different ways, so many wishes to speak or to stay silent. Some took after my quietness, others took after their father's loose tongue. And I realized that each one chose what to keep and what to show. I only asked God that they wouldn't inherit the fear of saying what they feel, because I know how much it costs to keep everything inside. There was a day when one of my granddaughters argued with her mother and came crying into my kitchen. She spoke fast, angry, saying no one understood her. I listened to everything without interrupting. When she was done, I thought of what my mother would have done, stayed silent. But I didn't want to repeat that. I held her hand and said that it was all right to feel afraid, to feel anger, to feel sadness, that it was better to speak than to swallow it. She looked at me in surprise, and in that moment, I felt that I was breaking a little piece of the chain that had lasted so long. Today, when I think about what I will leave behind when God calls me, I don't think of material things. I know little will remain, but I hope something more important will stay. The lesson that silence can be strength, but it doesn't have to be a prison. That keeping quiet can be a choice, but it shouldn't be a sentence. That feeling is not weakness, it is humanity. If I could, daughter, I would tell every one of mine to speak more, to say they love, to ask, to tell their fears. Because words are also inheritance. Words are also home. Words are the most beautiful way we have to meet one another. And if today you hear me telling all this, it is because I myself finally learned that there are silences that must turn into stories, so that no one carries alone the weight of thinking that feeling is wrong, so that no one inherits only the cold part of those whom life taught to be quiet. If there is one thing I learned in this life, it is that we take nothing with us except what we have built in our hearts. And if you want to know what was the greatest wealth I gathered in all these years, it wasn't the inherited pots, nor the house we raised with sacrifice, nor the few coins saved in the biscuit tin. It was this deep understanding that silence can be our greatest weapon, and in the same measure, our heaviest burden. I know today the world moves fast. Everyone wants to be right. Everyone wants to speak first. People are afraid of seeming weak, afraid of losing the argument. But if you ask me, I would say true courage isn't in the strength of your voice, but in the strength of knowing the right time to use it. And maybe that is the only advice I have to leave behind. If I could give you this advice, I would sit with you here on the porch, like I did so many times with your uncles, and I would tell you with all the calm that only time teaches. Learn to listen. Listen more than you speak, because so much reveals itself when we stop thinking about the answer and start truly paying attention. People carry pains they don't know how to name. Sometimes they shout, not because they want to hurt, but because they are hurting. And if you know how to listen, you will understand that not every offense is malice. Many are just a cry for help in disguise. But I also don't tell you to live as silent as I did. Don't make silence a hiding place for everything. Have the courage to speak when your heart asks, because there are words that save. There are embraces that only happen once we confess we need them. And I learned, at the cost of much loneliness, that saying, I care, I am sorry, I need you, doesn't diminish anyone. On the contrary, it shows only that we have a heart. If I could, my child, I would take all the times I kept quiet for fear of judgment and turn them into gestures of tenderness. I would have told your grandfather he was my companion, even when we hardly understood each other. I would have hugged your uncles on the days I saw sadness in their eyes. I would have written letters to myself, just to remember that the woman I was had a right to feel. But there is no use living with regret. Each of my silences had a reason. Some were shields, others were walls. Some protected me, others kept me apart. I no longer blame myself. I simply acknowledge, because acknowledgement is the first step to transform any inheritance. And if you have the chance to choose, always choose what brings you closer to the ones you love. When God takes me, I want you to remember this. I want you to tell your children that their grandmother was a woman who lived with courage, even when she looked weak, that I was never ashamed to learn late, that I made mistakes, but also got things right, and that deep down, I only wanted to protect my family in the only way I knew how. And if one day you feel your silence weighs more than it strengthens you, look inside and ask yourself if it isn't time to speak, because words also heal. Words also lift. Words are also prayer. And there are moments when they are the only thing that can keep our hearts from closing up for good. I don't know if life will be easier for you than it was for me, but I hope it will be freer, that you won't be afraid to feel, that you won't be ashamed to cry, that you won't be embarrassed to love with everything you have, because in the end, that is what remains, the love we had the courage to show. If I could leave you only one inheritance, it would be this: the wisdom to choose when to be silent and when to speak, the courage to stand in your truth without wounding, the humility to recognize when a word can do more good than silence. And finally, I would tell you that I am at peace, because I know you will follow your path with your successes and your mistakes, but with this advice kept in a corner of your heart. May it be your refuge on difficult days, and may it remind you that if silence was my greatest weapon, it was also the most beautiful lesson I could ever leave you. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.